Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and today I'm going to wrap up my discussion of the Timaeus. And as you can see, we're going to end today looking at the revolutions of the soul. So, to start us off, though, first I just want to say that throughout this whole talk, all these talks about the Timaeus, I've been using the translation of Robert Bury, and I've been using this Loeb series. I hope it's on camera correctly. I can't see what's on the camera right now, so I hope that's correct. But anyway, you see it's the Loeb series out of Harvard University. So that's what I've been using for the Timaeus. Okay, now throughout this dialogue, Plato has every so often been giving us some recaps. It's a very long dialogue, there's quite a bit here, so it's helpful to have these, and he does it again here. He says, "Seeing then that we have now lying before us and thoroughly sifted like wood ready for the joiner, the various kinds of causes out of which the rest of our account must be woven together, let us once more for the moment revert to our starting point, and thence proceed rapidly to the point from which we arrived hither. In this way we shall endeavor now to supplement our story with a conclusion and a crown in harmony with what has gone before." Okay, so last week we looked at the difference between the primary causes and the auxiliary causes. Why do I have so much trouble saying that word? So we saw those two kinds of causes last week, and so that's what he's referring to here. He says, "As we stated at the commencement, all these things were in a state of disorder, when God implanted in them proportions both severally in relation to themselves and in theory relations to one another, so far as it was in any way possible for them to be in harmony and proportion. He, Zeus, in the first place, set all these in order, and then out of these he constructed this present universe, one single living creature containing within itself all living creatures, both mortal and immortal. And he himself acts as the constructor of things divine. But the structure of the mortal things he commanded his own engendered sons to execute." So there's a summary of much of the mythological version of the story that we heard earlier in the dialogue. The making of the universe based on the looking to the intelligible as a model, and then creating the universe, and then the creation of the junior or young gods, and then the instructions of them. And going on with that, with those instructions, they, the junior gods, imitating their father, on receiving the immortal principle of soul, framed around it a mortal body, and gave it all the body to be its vehicle, and housed therein besides another form of soul, even the mortal form, which has within it passions both fearful and unavoidable. Firstly, pleasure, a most mighty lure to evil. Next, pains, which put good to rout. And besides these, rashness and fear, foolish counselors both, and anger, hard to dissuade, and hope, ready to seduce. And blending these with irrational sensation and with all daring lust, they thus compounded in necessary fashion the mortal kind of soul. And that brings us up to date of what we covered last week. So now we're going to go on. He's going to look again at the three parts of the soul that were introduced in the Republic. So remember that the Timaeus follows the Republic. It's a trilogy of sorts. We've got the Republic, the Timaeus, and then the Critias. So there are a lot of parallels between the Timaeus and the Republic. And when we get to the Critias, we'll see that there are parallels with the two previous ones as well. So just a quick recap for those who haven't seen the Republic in a while, or perhaps some of you haven't read it at all, which I do recommend you go back to it. So the three parts of the soul, very briefly, is there's the logos, or it's called in Greek, the logos of the soul, which is like the wisdom-loving part. And that's the part that is the leader. And then you've got the thumos, or the high-spirited part, sometimes called the anger part. And this is the part that functions ideally as a bodyguard, protecting the wisdom-loving part, which ideally is the leader. And then you've got the epithumius, which is like the desires in the soul. And in a healthy soul, these desires fall in line with what is wise. The three parts are all functioning together as a unity. So that would be the healthy soul. Those are the three parts as presented in the Republic. We're going to see references to them again, but this time you'll see that he's going to take it in a different direction. He's going to add locations in the body. He says, "Wherefore, since they scruple to pollute the divine, unless through absolute necessity, they planted the mortal kind apart therefrom in another chamber of the body, building an isthmus and boundary for the head and chest, by setting between them the neck, to the end that they might remain apart. And within the chest, or thorax as it is called, they fastened the mortal kind of soul. That part of the soul, then, which partakes of courage and spirit, since it is a lover of victory, they planted more near to the head, between the midriff and the neck, in order that it might hearken to the reason, and in conjunction therewith might forcibly subdue the tribe of the desires, whensoever they should utterly refuse to yield willing obedience to the word of command from the citadel of reason." So we see here that the reason-loving part of the soul is what ideally is the leader in the soul. And the part that is courageous and spirited is the part that acts as something of a bodyguard to that reason. "And the heart, which is the junction of the veins and the fount of the blood, which circulates vigorously through all the limbs, they appointed to be the chamber of the bodyguard, to the end that when the heat of the passion boils up, as soon as reason passes the word round that some unjust action is being done which affects them, either from without or possibly even from the interior desires, every organ of sense in the body might quickly perceive through all the channels both the injunctions and the threats, and in all ways obey and follow them, thus allowing their best part to be the leader of them all." Okay, so we're seeing here again the three parts of the soul, how they should properly function. We also see them tied to the body because throughout this whole dialogue, we've been seeing this similitude as we go from one realm to the next. And we're seeing here it as well, that within the body, there are physical correlates to what is happening in the soul. Although all of these passions and these thoughts and all of our senses are all in the soul, they do have their physical correlates, of course. And now he goes on to something curious, what he calls the organ of divination. "For they who constructed us, remembering the injunction of their father, when he enjoined upon them to make the mortal kind as good as they possibly could, they rectified the vile part of us by thus establishing therein what they're calling the organ of divination, that it might in some degree lay hold on truth, and that God gave unto man's foolishness the gift of divination is a sufficient token, is this, that nobody achieves true and inspired divination when in his rational mind, but only when the power of his intelligence is fettered in sleep, or when it is distraught by disease or by reason of some divine inspiration." Now, I imagine that passages like this are really baffling to those academic Platonists who want to argue that for Plato, the highest goal of humans is the rational mind. Because here it is very clear that there is something that he's putting higher, which is this gift of divination. And this also we see in the Republic, that dialectic is what leads us up to the experience of what he calls there, seeing the sun itself in its own place in the allegory of the cave, that highest experience, that experience of that like peak experience, or what in other systems is often called like an enlightenment experience. That kind of experience, some divine inspiration. We're not in our right mind, so to speak. This is not while we are doing dialectic. Dialectic is what leads us up to that experience, and it's what meets us on the way down. And it's that later use of dialectic where we might find some compatibility with those academics who say that the rational mind is the highest function for humans. But we see very clearly that there is this space in Platonism for this kind of divination or this kind of experience that is not what we would call rational. But he goes on to say that it belongs to a man when in his right mind, and here we have a form of phronesis, to recollect and ponder both the things spoken in dream or waking vision by the divining and inspired nature, and all the visionary forms that were seen, and by means of reasoning to discern about them all wherein they are significant, and for whom they portend evil or good in the future, the past, or the present. So here's where we may find some common ground with academics, because we also agree that that the highest, that wisdom, sorry to put it this way, that wisdom does not come through experience. It's not that divine inspiration that is the mark of wisdom. It's the understanding of the experience. And so it's using dialectic after the experience to understand the experience. This is where wisdom comes from. And so in this sense, I would agree with the academics that the rational mind is the highest function, in the sense that it brings us the understanding that we need to have wisdom. So while we may both make that statement, I think we mean it in different ways, because they don't recognize that need for experience that we recognize. Okay, but it is not the task of him who has been in a state of frenzy and still continues therein to judge the apparitions and voices seen or uttered by himself. For it was well said of old that to do and to know one's own and oneself belongs only to him who is sound of mind. Okay, so this is where I would argue then that you can make the case that being in the rational mind is what you need in order to know yourself, which is one of the goals, of course, of all philosophical and wisdom traditions. Okay, now he's going to go on, continuing the unfolding of reality. We've gone through humans, and now we're going to go on to the creation of plants. So taking all those primary triangles, which being unwarped and smooth, were best able to produce with exactness fire and water and air and earth, God separated them, each apart from his own kind, and mixing them one with another in due proportion, he fashioned therefrom the marrow, devising it as a universal seed stuff for every mortal kind. And blending it with other shapes and senses, they engineered a substance akin to that of humans, so as to form another living creature. Such are the cultivated trees and plants and seeds which have been trained by husbandry and are now domesticated among us. But formerly the wild kinds only existed, these being older than the cultivated kinds. For everything, in fact, which partakes of life may justly and with perfect truth be termed a living creature. So I think this passage is maybe where those Platonists who are vegetarians would point to make their case for why Platonists should be vegetarians. I personally am not a vegetarian, but I think you can make a strong case for it. And here we see that he doesn't talk about animals being cultivated or domesticated for humans, but he does talk about plants and seeds and trees. And we're going to also see as we go on that he talks about them as food. And so, there's one more here. Certainly that creature which we are now describing partakes of the third kind of soul, which is seated, as we affirm, between the midriff and the navel, and which shares not at all in opinion and reasoning and mind, but in sensation, pleasant and painful, together with desires. For inasmuch as it continues wholly passive, and does not turn within itself around itself, repelling motion from without, in using its own native motion, it is not endowed by its original constitution with a natural capacity for discerning or reflecting upon any of its own experiences. And this motion being described at the end here, of course, is that motion, that circular motion that the Greeks call ousia. And he's saying here that plants do not participate in that ousia that allows them to reflect on their own experiences. They don't participate in rational mind. And so that's another argument for why plants differ from animals and therefore can be eaten. Now he's going to go on from here to talk about energy channels. And you're going to find in this description that what he's talking about fits much more closely to what you might learn from a yogi talking about the energy channels in our body than you would from, say, a university anatomy class. He goes on to say that when our superiors had generated all these kinds as nutriment for us inferior beings, the plants, they channeled out our body itself, like as if they were cutting channels in gardens, to the end that it might be irrigated, as it were, by an inflowing stream. Now, I put this picture here because I think some of you maybe are not familiar with the yogic system, and you don't really need to be. But you've probably at least seen some diagram like this where you see that there are main energy channels throughout the body. And what is particularly relevant to this dialogue here of Plato's is this idea of an energy channel that runs up the spine, which the yogis call Shushumna. And then there are two channels that weave around it, and those they call Pingala and Ida. And what you're going to find in this dialogue is that what Plato is describing very much is consistent with this description. I'm going to give you one quote just to give you an example of it, and you'll see that there's this winding. It's this. Firstly, beneath the junction of the skin and flesh, they cut for hidden channels 2 veins along the back, seeing that the body was in fact double, with right side and left. And these they drew down along by the spine, and they're going to twist around just like Pingala and Ida, and they're going to wrap around the head and come to a point which would be roughly where the yogis put the third eye, or Ajna chakra. And so those who are familiar with that system will see a lot of parallels. Excuse me, sorry. You're going to see a lot of parallels. It's very curious. And for those who are not familiar with that system, this section here might seem a bit confusing, but it does have these parallels. And then after that long description, he's eventually going to come to the death of the body. Finally, when the bonds of the triangles in the marrow, which have been fitly framed together, no longer resist the strain, but fall asunder, they let slip in turn the bonds of the soul. And it, when thus naturally set loose, flies out gladly. For whereas every process which is contrary to nature is painful, that which takes place naturally is pleasurable. Okay, so describing death as a natural part of life, that we're going to be born many times, and we come into bodies and we leave them, and it's a perfectly natural process, nothing to fear. So too, in like manner, the death which occurs in consequence of disease or by wounds is painful and violent, but that which follows on old age and constitutes a natural end is the least grievous of deaths, and is accompanied by more pleasure than of pain. And so from here he's going to go on to talk about diseases. A little bit about disease of the body, but mostly focusing on disease of the soul. And we must agree that folly is a disease of the soul. And of folly there are 2 kinds. The one which is madness, the other ignorance. Whatever affection a person suffers from, if it involves either of these conditions, it must be termed disease. And we must maintain that pleasures and pains in excess are the greatest of the soul's diseases. Okay, so the disease of the soul then is folly, and it comes in 2 categories, madness and ignorance. Indeed, most of those affections which are called by way of reproach incontinence in pleasure or lack of self-control, as though the wicked acted voluntarily, are wrongly so reproached. For no one is voluntarily wicked, but the wicked person becomes wicked by reason of some evil condition of body and unskilled nurture. And these are experiences which are hateful to everyone and are involuntary. So here's a basic tenet of Platonism, the idea that nobody does wrong voluntarily. So even when you know that what you're doing is illegal or hurtful or immoral, hurtful to yourself, to someone else, still there must be some reason that you think this is a good thing to do. And so there's some form of ignorance at play, because nobody does wrong voluntarily. The truly healthy person, the person healthy in soul, finds that condition of soul that I talked about earlier, where the whole soul is functioning as a unity, where the desires and the passions naturally fall in line with what is wise and good for that person. So nobody does wrong nobody does wrong voluntarily. Whenever the humors which arise from acid and saline phlegms and all humors that are bitter and bilious wander through the body and find no external vent, but are confined within, and they mingle their vapor with the movement of the soul, and are blended therewith, they implant diseases of the soul of all kinds, varying in intensity and in extent. And as these humors penetrate to the three regions of the soul, according to the region which they severally attack, they give rise to all varieties of bad temper and bad spirits, and they give rise to all manner of rashness and cowardice, and of forgetfulness also, as well as of stupidity. So here again, he's tying the soul and the body together, showing the similitude there. But I most want to point out here is that he's talking about the three regions of the soul, which is like the three aspects of the soul, which he connected to three physical body parts. And I would suggest here that when he's talking about bad temper and bad spirits, he's talking about the desire-loving part of the soul. When he's talking here about rashness and cowardice, he's referring to the high-spirited part of the soul. And forgetfulness and stupidity is a reference to the wisdom-loving part of the soul. Furthermore, when, with people in such an evil condition, the political administration also is evil, and the speech in the cities, both public and private, is evil or unhealthy. And when, moreover, no lessons that would cure these evils are anywhere learned from childhood, thus it comes to pass that all of us who are wicked become wicked owing to two quite involuntary causes. And for these we must always blame the begetters more than the begotten, and the nurses more than the nurslings. Yet at the same time, each of us must endeavor as best we can by means of nurture and by our pursuits and studies to flee the unhealthy condition of soul and pursue the good condition. And so here we're seeing him tying in the Timaeus to the Republic, where we saw about the education of the soul. And we remember from the Republic that there was that analogy of the city-state to the soul. And so when he's talking about political administration, it has a dual meaning. But we see here the idea that if we are raised in an unhealthy environment, if our parents and our caregivers around us all have that unhealthy condition of soul, they suffer from foolishness or from ignorance, then we're going to be affected by that, obviously. And the culture that we're raised in, the city we're raised in, the whole environment around us has a strong effect. But still, he's saying here at the end that even though it's not our fault that we were raised in that environment, it was involuntary, still we have the responsibility to get that kind of education that he described in the Republic. If we didn't get it in childhood, well, he wrote us a dialogue that helps us get it now. And so it is our responsibility to gain for ourselves the kind of education he described there. He talked about music and gymnastics in a way that was different from what the words generally mean. He also talked about the various pursuits and studies that we should engage in. And this brings us then to the treatment for the diseases of body and mind. Again, it is reasonable and proper to set forth in turn the subject complementary to the foregoing. So the foregoing was the diseases, the complementary then, the remedial treatment of body and mind, and the causes which conserve this. For what is good merits description more than what is evil or unhealthy. All that is good is fair. This translator used the word fair. I keep pointing out here that he means beautiful. The Greek word is beautiful. And the beautiful is not void of due measure. Wherefore also the living creature that is to be beautiful must be symmetrical. Symmetrical not only in physical form, but also symmetry of the soul. From both of these evils, referring to the being unsymmetrical in body or in soul, the one means of salvation is this: never to exercise the soul without the body, nor the body without the soul, so that they may be evenly matched in sound of health. Thus, the student of mathematics or of any other subject who works very hard with his intellect must also provide his body with exercise by practicing gymnastics, while he who is diligent in molding his body must in turn provide his soul with motion by cultivating music and philosophy in general, if either is to deserve to be called truly both beautiful and good. Now we're going to see in this dialogue here that he's using gymnastics and music very much along the lines of its usual use, but we're also going to see that parallel of what we saw in the Republic, where both are talking about the movement of energy. And in this dialogue in particular, the idea of the motion, the idea of ousia, is very strong throughout this dialogue. The motion of the universe, it's also the motion of our soul, it's the motion that is cultivated through music and philosophy, and it's strengthened and unified through what he calls gymnastics. The various parts likewise must be treated in the same manner, in imitation of the form of the universe. And so now we're tying in that theme that's been running throughout, that we want to bring our souls, the motion of our soul, in line with the motion of the universe. And we're going to see that theme carry to the end. Further, as concerns the motion, the best motion is that caused by itself in itself, for this is most nearly akin to the motion of intelligence and the motion of the universe. Now, I almost didn't use this translation because of this part here that I crossed out. I do like this translation overall. It's very smooth, and I think that it lends itself well to this format, which is why I ultimately decided to use it. But this is a very important line, and unfortunately our translator added a few words. This is not in the Greek. I've not seen it in any other translation. It's only Bury's idea, and it's not accurate, because the motion that is caused by itself in itself is that motion that we call ousia. That is what Plato calls the best motion, and it's not the motion of the body, it's the motion of the soul and the motion of the universe. And this is the motion that is most nearly akin to the motion of intelligence and the motion of the universe, this motion in the soul. Maybe he could have added the words of the soul to make it a parallel to the universe, but it's also the motion that's this higher functioning of it is occurring in the universe in the whole. And then motion due to the agency of another is less good. So the motion of our body is caused by the soul, and so that's less good than the motion of the soul. And the least good motion is that which is imparted to a body lying in a state of rest, and which moves it piecemeal and by means of others. So picking up something else, something that is completely inanimate, it's being moved completely by something else. Concerning both the composite living creature and the bodily part of it, how a person should both guide and be guided by himself so as to live a most rational life, let our statement stand thus, that we want to bring that motion of the soul in order. And he's going to clarify that even more in this last section, which I'm calling the healthy soul. But first, and with special care, we must make ready the part which is to be the guide to the best of our power, so that it may be as beautiful and good as possible for the work of guidance. So up to this point, there is a strong psychological aspect, and if you were not really in the study of metaphysics, but you did bring your soul into some degree of harmony and order and unity, then you would be someone who has perhaps a high degree of what we might call practical wisdom, and we see many people like that in the world. They live a good, happy life, and they're good at giving advice about practical matters, but they don't necessarily have that higher vision of what it means to be human. However, we must take special care to not just have that psychological version of health, but to have true psychical health means to also understand the full potential of what it means to be human and to live at that higher level. And that's what he's saying here. We declare that God has given to each of us as his daimon that kind of soul which is housed in the head of our body and which raises us, seeing that we are not an earthly, but a heavenly plant, up from earth towards that kindred in the heaven. And herein we speak most truly, for it is by suspending our head and root from that region whence the substance of our soul first came to that divine power keeps up. Sorry, I read something wrong there. And herein we speak most truly, for it is by suspending our head and root from that region whence the substance of our soul first came that the divine power keeps upright our whole body. That's better. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that it's good to have that practical sort of wisdom, but it's not enough to truly reach our goal, our highest potential, because we are not an earthly plant, but a heavenly one. And he goes on even further. He who has seriously devoted himself to learning and to true thoughts, which is a reference here which uses the word phronesis, and has exercised these qualities above all others, must necessarily and inevitably think thoughts that are immortal and divine, if so be that he lays hold on truth. And in so far as it is possible for human nature to partake of immortality, he must fall short thereof in no degree. And inasmuch as he is forever tending his divine part, in duly magnifying that daimon who dwells along with him, he must be supremely blessed. Okay, so this is our goal, to reach this higher state of mind, this higher understanding of what it means to be human, and then also to live it in the world. Because remember, we're tying this to the Republic. The idea of the philosopher king is someone who has this state of mind, who has developed this level of wisdom, who has developed that unity of soul, such that allows that person to function in the world from this lofty and impressive place. And the way of tendance of every part of every one of us is one, namely, to supply each with its own congenial food and motion, or food and motion from its original source. And for the divine part within us, the congenial motions are the intellections and the revolutions of the universe. These each one of us should follow, rectifying the revolutions within our head, which were distorted at our birth, by learning the harmonies and revolutions of the universe, and thereby making the part that thinks like unto the object of its thought, in accordance with its original nature, and having achieved this likeness, attain finally to that goal of life which is set before us by the gods as the most good, both for the present and for the time to come. So here we see him finally tying in what he's saying about the soul to what he had said about the universe, that the motions that are most proper to the wisdom-loving part of our soul is the motions that are of the universe. These were distorted at birth, but we want to bring ourselves into unity with the universe, and that is the education of the soul as described in the Republic. This would be our original nature. This is one of our goals. The goal of life which is set before us by the gods is to bring ourselves back to this state of wisdom and to function in the world in this way. And so here's how he wraps it all up. And now at length we may say that our discourse concerning the universe has reached its termination. And for this our cosmos has received the living creatures, both mortal and immortal, and been thereby fulfilled, it being itself a visible living creature, embracing the visible creatures, a perceptible God, made in the image of the intelligible, most great and good and beautiful and perfect in its generation, even this one heaven, soul of its kind. And that wraps up the Timaeus. If you like what you saw, I do hope that you will hit the like button. Also, maybe share with some of your friends who might enjoy this kind of content. And if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below, or there's an email address in the description box. And also, please think about subscribing if you don't already. I do put out a new video about once a week. I've been pretty good about it so far. My kids are on summer vacation now, so we'll see how this goes. But if you subscribe, you will get a notification when you hit that little icon bell. Next week, or next time, I plan to go on to the Critias, which will wrap up this trilogy. So I do hope that you'll join me then. Thank you.